Okay, it's 12:30 and I think we are ready to start. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of 4 conversations for the future of Europe. This year taking place in the framework of the EGPP seminar series happening on Wednesdays at lunchtime over the course of the whole academic year. So for those of you who connect for the first time, my name is Lorenzo Cicchi. I am the EGPP coordinator and I will be chairing today's session. It is a pleasure to see a lot of familiar and some new faces for the conversation led by Kalypso Nicolaidis today, titled A Democratic Panopticon for the Recovery Fund as a new form of permanent citizen involvement in EU decision-making. Let me thank you, some people now. First, I would like to thank Philip Van Parijs for the honor of co-organizing the conversation with him for the second year after last year. And organizing seminars in person while sipping coffee over the Schifanoia terrace is quite easy. But doing this in a pandemic world with continuous emailing back and forth can be tiring. But with Philip, even this has been extremely pleasant and stimulating as well. So I'm really indebted to him for this experience. And I also thank Daniele Caramani, the new EGPP director, for hosting the conversations as a kind of special event of the EGPP seminar series. And I extend his excuses to the room for not being here today, but he's currently traveling back from Switzerland at the moment. I thank the speaker, Kalypso Nicolaidis, and the discussants, Hanna, Werner, and Albena Azmanova, for having enthusiastically accepted our invitation. And finally, let me also acknowledge the support of our admin and comms team, Martina and Sara, for the virtual logistics of the event. Now, before I move on to some more practical issues of format, timing, and technicalities, I leave the floor to Philip, who will give some opening remarks, reinstating the spirit of the conversation. He will also present today's topic and introduce the panelists more in detail. So thank you, Philip. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and it's also been a pleasure for me to prepare all this together with you. Hello from Brussels, from the European Quarter in Brussels, where I am now, even though I can't show it in by way of background. And welcome to this first in the new series of conversations for the future of Europe. These conversations differ from standard seminars because they rest on the combination of 2 convictions, which were expressed as follows in the sort of mission statement, which Brigitte Laffen and I concocted together when we launched this initiative 3 years ago. Conviction 1, in order to guide the steps of the European Union and in order to mobilize its citizens so as to make such steps possible, it is not enough to analyze the past and to criticize the present. It is crucial to concoct concrete proposals for a better future and to subject them to no-nonsense multidisciplinary discussion. Conviction number 2, the concern for concreteness and political feasibility should not prevent us from bearing in mind Max Weber's warning at the end of his famous booklet, Politik als Beruf. Certainly, all historical experience confirms the truth that man or woman, no doubt, would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. The concern for feasibility is compatible with boldness. Indeed, it may require it. The bold proposal that is going to be subjected to this no-nonsense multidisciplinary discussion today is a new form of permanent citizens' involvement in EU decision-making, in particular in relationship with the use to be made of the European recovery funds. This bold proposal is going to be presented to you by Kalypso Nicolaidis. Kalypso studied at the Sorbonne and at Sciences Po Paris before getting a doctorate from Harvard. She then became an associate professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard and later became professor of international relations at the University of Oxford and fellow of St. Anthony's College. She's now on leave from that position and has become, official title is professorial chair in transnational governance at the School of Transnational Governance of the EUI. She published as author or editor many books, the latest one being Exodus, Reckoning, Sacrifice, Three Meanings of Brexit, which she also, core of which she also presented as a Max Weber lecture at EUI. Among the other books she published, I'll just mention one, which was for me a real eye-opener and an illustration of the difficulties faced by today's proposal, I think, which is the book she co-edited with Justine Lacroix called European Stories, Intellectual Debates on Europe in National Context, showing how diverse these discussions could be. I should add that I had the pleasure of running jointly with Kalypso, with philosopher David Miller and lawyer Pavlos Eleftheriadis. We had the pleasure of running a seminar on justice and democracy beyond the nation state in Oxford between 2011 and 2015. It wasn't enough to prevent the Brexit, but it certainly helped us think about the sort of issues we are going to discuss today. As commentators, we'll have Albena Azmanova, who took her master's degree from the University of Sofia in Bulgaria, then a certificate in European Studies at the University of Strasbourg, and a doctorate from the New School of Social Research in New York. She became then an assistant, she was an assistant professor for a while at the New School, then maître de conférence at Sciences Po Paris until she took a job, which she still has now, of associate professor in political and social theory at the Brussels campus of the University of Kent. She is currently a visiting fellow at the Institut für Wissenschaften des Menschen in Vienna. She published two books, both with Columbia University Press, one called The Scandal of Reason, A Critical Theory of Political Judgment, the other one, Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or a Utopia. She also published a large number of articles, including one she published jointly with Kalypso, in Social Europe. But as I mentioned just before we opened, this was not on today's topic, because had it been on today's topic, we wouldn't have invited them together, because we don't want to have just people sharing exactly the same position on the issue to contribute to this conversation. Finally, we have Hannah Werner, who took her BA from the University of Mannheim, then did a master at the University of Amsterdam, and a joint doctorate at the universities of Leuven and Amsterdam last year. So a fresh doctor. A doctorate was on titled Pragmatic Citizens, a bottom-up perspective on participatory politics. She's now a postdoc. Her boss told me a brilliant postdoc at the KU Leuven in the research group called Democratic Innovations and Legitimacy, directed by Sophie Marine. She's involved in two projects directly related to today's topics. One is called Deliberative Quality of Political Debate, and the other one is called Citizens' Involvement. Among her publications, I'll just mention one called How Involving the Few Generates Legitimacy Perceptions Among the Many. So these are the three people we were pleased to be able to welcome for this first conversation on the future of Europe, for the future of Europe. Back to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Philip. So now for the format and timing, Kalypso has 15 to 20 minutes for her initial bold proposal, which is followed by 8 to 10 minutes each to Albena and Anna in this order for their discussion. If the timing is respected, I will go back to Kalypso for a first reaction to the comments raised by the discussants. And in the remaining time, I will moderate in the best of my capacities the Q&A session and the discussion. If we go over time and there are plenty of questions, we may open up the floor to the other participants right after the discussant's input. We will improvise a bit on this. Now for the technicalities, the usual apply. Make sure your microphone is muted and remember to unmute it when you speak or have a question. If you can, I invite everybody to keep their video on. So in order to retain a kind of a feeling of presence and community, even though we are all on Zoom. For the questions during the presentation, please limit yourself to just clarificatory question. For more general ones, please wait for the Q&A. In both cases, you can write down your name in the public chat, wait for the acknowledgement by the panelist or by myself. Then remember to unmute your microphone and then speak up. You can also use the raise of hand function to signal that you want to speak. And please refrain from writing down the actual question in the chat. It's better to engage in a proper conversation. Finally, if you have a pressing technical issue, please open up a private line of chat with either me, Martina Popova, or the EGPP account. There is Sarah Bernstein behind it. And finally, I will send a private message to the speaker when she has 5 minutes left, and to the discussants when they have only 2 minutes to conclude. So without further ado, thank you again, and Kalypso, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo and Philip, for so honored to help launch these conversations, not only because it allows me to pretend to be in Florence when I'm in Paris right now, but really like my friend and oft-time co-conspirator, Philip, I'm very keen, and like many of you, to always try to link, high theory and democratic activism. And Philip, I think it's fair to say, since you are convening this series, that for me, you are the beacon in how to elegantly practice this grand écart as both a citizen, a political citizen, and a scholar. So in the spirit of this conversation, I do want to propose something very tentative. In fact, inspired by the last year, my participation in a wonderful alliance of NGOs called Citizens Take Over Europe, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, as well as by the many ideas that have emerged in the context of this EUI Democracy Forum that I have been convening in the last few months, some of you being part of it. Of course, the proposal is full of holes, so I'm really looking forward to you shooting it down in this no-nonsense, multidisciplinary discussion. There are many friends in the room, and Philip and Lorenzo, of course. Hannah, you have done magnificent work on democratic innovation, and Albena on the political economy of democracy. So get your academic guns out, please, for me. Now, I just want to make 5 points, 2 minutes each. Lorenzo, I'll try to keep in time. First, the proposal itself, the concrete proposal, which of course is that the future of EU legitimacy, rests, I would say, we're talking democracy. So let me say on democratic recovery and resilience in Europe. So what better way to test this proposition than by asking, how are we going to spend the so-called Recovering and Resilience Fund of 750 billion euros, biggest and first ever commonly financed pot of gold from the EU, right? And of course, we all realize that this fund raises, the two most important ultimate democratic question, which is how do you distribute the redistributive question of sacrifices and benefits, who decides, and no taxation without representation. And in this case, we know that this fund will be paid back one way or another by taxes, whether it's individual taxes, corporate taxes, border taxes, or inflation, a form of tax, right? But of course, I'm amending this, this slogan today, like many of us do, by saying no taxation without participation, which is in a way a broader term than representation. We'll come back to this. So the concrete proposal is in fact to definitely build on e-democracy, perhaps use a version of the wonderful platform that the Commission has built for the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is a participatory platform, which is both vertical to connect with stuff Brussels does, but also horizontal for citizens to connect between themselves, and something that allows for decentralized, localized debate on social media and physically, but that provides the resources for it. And of course, a platform that therefore shows off every way, in a transparent way, in the 27 member states in which every cent of those funds are used at the local, city, national level, including technical information about how the way this money is spent corresponds to certain criteria, above all on the green transition. We can come back to that. And just to make it clear, the whole idea here is to consider it as an experiment, huge, large-scale experiment, but nevertheless, an experiment to be scaled up to the EU budget and other mechanisms over time. Point 2, why use the image of the Democratic Panopticon? After all, there are many, reports, inputs by academics, including in this room. I'm not the first one to say, hey, Green Deal Europe needs to be full of democratic participation, etc. But if you look at the EU 2 documents, Just Transition Platform and the EU Climate Pact of last December, what we see are, statements of, we need consultation. Yes, of course, assemblies, big deal. It's very important to have citizens' assembly, local projects. The EU Climate Pact speaks of, having ambassadors, citizens' pledges, satellites event, all good stuff. But my point is really to obey the command, the second command that Philip, raised for us. Philip, your command of boldness and reaching out for the impossible, the Weberian comp. And in this case, I think that for us scholars, activists, we do want to recognize that democracy is kind of boringly uncontested. The EU states, it acknowledges that citizens' participation in the Green Deal is vital to ensure blah, 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 blah. Can you imagine the Commission stating that, EU citizen participation is optional? Why doesn't it ever say that? Okay, so, and we know, of course, that, democracy may be uncontested as a word, as a principle, but it's hugely contested in practice, of course, around the world. But even in the EU, I'm not sure that semi-autocrats, vertical leaders, bureaucrats, populists, etc., all over the world, all over our union, our own union, don't really, at the end of the day, tend to think I, the people, not we, the people. So this is why I wanted to label my proposal in a really provocative way, because of course, as you'll recognize, the Democratic Panopticon is a way to subvert Jeremy Bentham's model prison, which he was obsessed with, of course, for a long time. And his Panopticon was, of course, to allow all prisoners of any institutions to be observed by a single security guard without the inmates being able to tell whether they are being watched. So yes, in this case, we want to turn this around and talk about permanent participation by citizens in European policy making. But of course, when we say permanent, it's as a whole, because it will be always by some of the time on some of the issues. So the beauty of Bentham's vision is that it implies the fear, not the fact that you might be watched. Because of course, the inmates can never know. Our political inmates, our bureaucrats, our politicians will never know whether they're being watched. And in other words, this idea of panopticon is a manifestation of Bentham's belief that power should be visible and unverifiable, so that our elites, like the inmates, are effectively compelled to regulate their own behavior under the assumption that citizen power should be visible and to some extent unverifiable, but you always need to assume it. And of course, the subversive dimension doesn't escape any of you, that from Foucault's disciplinary society to Zubov's surveillance capitalism, we all understand that the panopticon is not a building. It's a mechanism of power, a diagram of political technology that we want to turn it around. And this is why, this permanent dimension is so important in the proposal. And of course, when we say permanent, we embed, and I want to embed this proposal in a set of other proposals that are about permanence, including the Manifesto for European Citizens Assembly that we put together at CTOE, which is all about a permanent citizens assembly. So the question is, what is the input? What is these kinds of assembly embedded in it? So that's the panopticon dimension. The third point, we can discuss a lot, I hope in the Q&A, where to situate this proposal in democratic theory and in the panoply of democratic innovation. So let me say just two things here. One is, negatively, you could say it's a very simple and very modest proposal, however provocative. It's all about accountability. It's what Rosan Vallon called negative democracy. In fact, to enhance, add on to representative democracy, keep representatives on their toes. But, how about we together reading it much more radically as the next democratic frontier beyond representation and beyond mere participation, about really how to think permanence, since democracy as we know it, whether representative or direct, is all about episodic moments. And indeed, as a mechanism to counterbalance one of the greatest threat of our time, which is surveillance capitalism, which is social media, unaccountable, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about accountability, but also, a kind of digital republicanism, if we can put it that way, a kind of warranty of freedom from domination, which is above all in our society, domination through knowledge. So I just said that it's about embedding all these other mechanisms of consultation, assemblies, etc., in a much more inclusive, potentially inclusive, and we can come back to this process, as indeed the ultimate sign that the EU needs to trust Europeans. Wow, what a proposal. And Hannah, I'm sure since you work on that trust in politics, you'll have much to say on that. Fourth point. So yeah, what are the functions, the democratic functions of such a democratic panopticon? I mean, they're kind of obvious, guys. I mean, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. Let me give three, but please add or tell me doesn't work. And I know Albena will be on her feet on this. Obviously, democratic legitimization of the process of the recovery fund, of what the EU does. And indeed, potentially a bridge with the Conference on the Future of Europe, like a flagship experiment that could be institutionalized and could be a way of thinking about inclusiveness through the hybrid mechanism, right? Secondly, of course, we all talk a lot about Hungary, the rule of law conditionality of these funds. And Albena and I are concerned with this. And yes, Philip, that's the one place where we did write together. And of course, we're thinking very hard of how this would work. But the idea is to take conditionality all the way down, create accountability by empowering Hungarians or Poles or whoever else across the EU. In fact, let's not have double standards, to watch, how are you going to use this fund? Nepotistically, what goes in whose pockets? And we keep on saying, well, the funds should go directly to municipalities, etc. Let them go directly in the eyes and minds of the people. And that's one way of ensuring rule of law conditionality. And thirdly, I would add effectiveness. That's a big debate. I know Albena might have something to say about this, but I personally believe in the wisdom of the crowds. There's a lot of literature on how democracy creates more efficient allocation. And as well as issues about pledges on dishonesty and etc. but we can again come back to this. And my fifth and last point, Lorenzo, is to consider in advance, to protect myself, not quite to protect myself, to provoke, what are the objections to this proposal? And that's where I'm excited to hear what you'll want to say. But let me kind of think about objections in a specific way, as basically objections that I want to respond to by thinking of oh, no, your objections are not valid, but what would it take as conditions of possibility for the objections not to be valid? And that's where I bring in, some of you have heard me and might be tired of hearing me talk about Robert Dahl's third democratic transformation. But in what I mean when I keep on going on about the third democratic transformation is to say that it's kind of happening anyway. If you watch our students and young people, we're there. And the question for EU institutions and their legitimacy, as well as our governments at every level, is whether we accompany it, whether we magnify it, make it possible, make it super cool, or whether we resist it. That's the question. Magnifying or resisting the third democratic transformation, or in fact killing it. Maybe the institutions have the power to kill it. And that requires both a certain ethos and a certain praxis, as well as institutions. And here, just to close, I would say there are three dimensions to that democratic transformation, all of which are ways of responding to the objections to the Panopticon. One is translational, that it's all about democracy happening in different contexts and scale, and how you help together think about your translations from these different levels. And in the same way as Decidim and Council in Barcelona, for instance, are being used by the EU, in the same way as I would like to advocate that let's look at Porto Alegre participatory budgeting at the municipal level. What does that mean at the EU level? How do you scale up diagonally, upward, downward, etc.? Secondly, transnational, obviously. So this is about how do you witness the use of these funds, not just in your local parochial level, but across, and therefore learn to take into account positive and negative externalities. And thirdly, of course, this third democratic transformation is transgenerational. And it's all about asking whether the EU can pivot from a politics of space to a politics of time, become the guardian of the long term, and think about redistribution from the short to the long term, and who decides. Because if that's not owned by its citizens, we are in deep shit with the green transition. So I'm happy to discuss my proposition in those terms about honing in on the third democratic revolution. I would say they're all mechanisms for the radical expansion of the franchise. I can expand on that. But let me end, Lorenzo, by coming back to the Panopticon, because, Bentham, at the end of the day, he asked, who guards the guardians? And in our stories, the guardians are the citizens or the peoples. We can talk about the difference. And I would suggest that who guards the guardians in this story are the others of our citizens, in other spaces of democracy, in other countries, and in others in time, those unborn others for whom we need to become responsible ancestors. Thank you. And I was just 17 minutes, so I hope I was under time.
Thank you so much, Kalypso, for staying perfectly on time, 7 minutes sharp. So without further ado, now the floor to Albena for 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kalypso, you asked for it. I have my guns out. This striking project for a democratic panopticon promises to solve the most uncomfortable issue for democratic theory in practice, that of the responsibility for the larger and longer-term societal well-being. The problem was spotted already 200 years ago by Alexis de Tocqueville, Much as he was a fan of democracy, he noted that it tends to prioritize the short-term perspective as the democratic vote translates people's valid preoccupations about their immediate livelihoods into binding policy. The famous problem of political presentism, focus on the present. This is indeed the predicament of modern democracies. And we need to start with that. We need to address it. On the one hand, democratically a responsive rule responsive to people's concerns, is not automatically a socially responsible rule that is prone to take into account a larger and long-term impact on society. At the same time, and this is the other part of the trouble, even the best informed and well-intended actions of central authority, in the rare instances when this is the case, are not necessarily immune to autocratic elitism and abuse of power. They need to be tied down to the real concerns of the demos. So this has always been the predicament of democratic theory and practice. And with the notion of permanent participation, of permanent expansion of the franchise, as Kalypso Nicolaidis lays it out, this suggests enhancing both citizens' input into policy and strengthening the accountability of rulers who feel perpetually watched. So this problem seems to be solved. And yet, I would like to ask, is this a sufficient safeguard against the trouble of political presentism? In other writings, Kalypso Nicolaidis has urged that the European Commission should be a guardian of the long term. But wouldn't the Democratic Panopticon tie it down even faster to the short term? On what grounds can we expect that the citizens in the Democratic Panopticon would effectively prioritize end of the world concerns over end of the month worries, to use the famous phrasing of one yellow vest protester? The opposite is more likely, judging from the experience we already have with the European Green Deal, which has been opposed by both employers' organizations and some trade unions on grounds of immediate economic impact, loss of jobs, costly transition, etc. I have another query, though. Let's say we solve this question by, saying that the practice of citizens' involvement is a learning process, and citizens might learn to look in the longer view, to take the longer view and the short, rather than the shorter concerns. There is another problem. If we open the black box of the demos, we will see not only a variety of interests that are pulling policy in often conflicting directions, from owners of polluting companies to students protesting pollution. We can tackle this with proper representation and inclusion, but we would also observe, opening that black box, a population afflicted with anxiety caused by pressures to work longer hours on multiple jobs, on employment contracts that are increasingly insecure, chasing fewer and fewer available jobs. This is the reality of contemporary capitalism. I observe in my recent book, Capitalism on Edge, precarity is the social disease of our time, which has dramatic political consequences. This insecurity, for instance, is nurturing negative political attitudes. As people are overworked, anxious, and longing for stability, they become either politically passive or getting radicalized in a far-right direction. We have seen this with the upsurge of right-wing populism in recent years. So precarity leaves neither the time nor the mental space for political participation. As one of my critics wrote about my hopes that the precariat will push for policy change, she wrote, hope to organize politically with these people, try inviting them for dinner. So it seems to me that we need to also think of the socioeconomic enabling conditions for such democratic participation. And those I would see in terms of serious overhaul of the political economy of European societies away from the pressures of the profit motive. We cannot blame capitalism for eroding democracy in such deep ways and try to reverse that erosion with more democracy. What we need is less capitalism. These are my remarks so far.
Okay, thank you, Albena, also for staying perfectly in time, even less than what you had. You had 8 minutes, you're to 5, maybe you will take the floor later on. So now I pass the floor to Hannah. And before that, let me say to the audience that if you want, you can start either raising your hand or writing down your name down in the public chat so I can start collecting the order of questions for the Q&A. Okay, Hannah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank Lorenzo and Felipe for this opportunity to discuss the super interesting proposal, and to Kalypso and Albena for this discussion so far. As was mentioned before, the research that I do in our team at the KU Leuven really focuses on this question whether participatory processes, such as citizens' assemblies, can tackle a legitimacy deficit. And in my research, I really try to take a citizen's perspective to think about, well, what are the benefits of such kind of processes for citizens? What can they get out of this? And you will see this perspective come back in my comments. So first, I would like to make a very sort of general point that I think the enthusiasm around participatory processes has often led to this some kind of sentiment that they are a catch-all solution for all sorts of problems in a democracy. And I think it's super important that we are very clear about what specific problem do we expect these processes. Is it what we want? Is that policy change? Do we want better epistemic outcomes? Is it inclusion? Is it perceived legitimacy? So if you think about the European Union, what is the specific problem that the EU has that we can address with such a process? And I think asking this question is very important to, on the one hand, assess, okay, are these processes actually a good tool to solve this particular problem? And also to help us make really good design choices about how do we set up such a process? What are the conditions under which it would work? And I think now Albena has already talked about some of these potential goals. So for instance, will they actually lead in better future-oriented policies? And I think there's indeed an interesting debate about this, whether we can expect citizens to be more future-oriented than politicians or not. And very often, however, the goal that is discussed, and I think that came really through in Kalypso's presentation as well, the goal is to improve legitimacy. And very often what is meant by that is perceived legitimacy, so that citizens would bestow this legitimacy on the institution that organizes these processes. And of course, that shines through in many proposals for citizens' assemblies on all sorts of levels of governance, especially now that we see this increase in participatory processes across Europe. And that's exactly the kind of research that we do. And I would like to stress first really generally that it's very much not obvious whether that actually works in practice. So it's not clear whether having participatory processes where citizens are selected by random selection, come together and deliberate and have a recommendation or either make the decisions, whether that would actually lead to citizens having more favorable attitudes towards the process, the decisions that come out of these processes, and the institutions. So just sum up the literature, what do we know so far from the empirics? I would say we do see a net positive effect. However, it's small and it's very conditional. And this, most of this research on the local level. So this would be even more difficult to obtain on higher levels of governance, such as the EU. So what my own research really shows is that actually very few citizens are unconditional cheerleaders of participatory processes. So most citizens consider them as a tool that can potentially address certain problems that they see in a democracy. But this means very concretely that it cannot be enough to organize such processes and then expect there to be this positive influence on legitimacy perceptions. It means that we have to be very concrete about what should these processes solve, what kind of problems that citizens have should these processes solve, and then also realize these expectations. And a very important expectation here is the question of uptake. So actually, when they express support for more participatory opportunities, they have very concrete policy expectations, or expectations that these processes will actually result in substantial changes in the policies they receive. And I think that's this sort of instrumental orientation towards processes is actually a good thing, because it means citizens actually do think really pragmatically about how can democracy be designed to deliver on the needs that I have. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is that many citizens expect these processes to improve the problem that they don't feel heard, elite. And both of these sentiments and demands require that participatory process have very visible influences. And if they don't, the research that we do in our team really shows that there can be these backlash effects. So even when recommendations of such processes are not fully implemented, so even if they are partially implemented, this can already result in frustration and this perception that citizens were just used for some kind of participatory show. And they did not influence. And from this importance of uptake, I think there are several dilemmas that kind of result from it that I would quickly like to go into. So there are some goal conflicts. So we do know that uptake is really crucial, and that citizens are skeptical of participation that is just for show. And legitimacy does depend on the influence such processes have. And very often this means in practice that these processes are designed to be on a very small, niche, concrete policy topic where recommendations can rather easily be implemented, so that we would actually indeed see an uptake of the recommendations. But of course, these processes are also running the risk of only making very small changes at the margins and otherwise just preserving the status quo of current decision making. And then that would mean that these processes, and this is a critique that is often voiced, are actually not a progressive tool, but rather cement the current state of affairs. So then the last option, which I think is the one that Kalypso also suggests here, is to say, no, we should actually use citizens' assemblies on a higher level where they can decide about very important policy issues, and it's binding, and they have the decision-making power. And I think there it's really Christina Lafon's arguments that are really relevant here. Is the question, well, but then why would citizens in such an assembly actually have the legitimacy to make this decision? Because, and I thought it was interesting that this came back in your discussion about accountability. Of course, the problem is that such a participatory forum itself, there is no accountability mechanism to check in with the people that made the decision in these forums, because they are not up for re-election later. So for this lack of accountability, then often the argument that is used is, yes, but they gain the legitimacy through being representative. And here I also thought it was interesting that he said, well, we should move away from representation and move to participation. But of course, what it means in practice, especially on such a governance level as the European Union, but also on a national or regional levels, we would take a handful of citizens. It's a tiny proportion of the population that would in practice be involved in such a process. So in the end, this is also representation. It's another kind of representation, and it functions through different mechanisms, but this is representation through citizens. And here there is this theoretical problem that Lafont really emphasizes, that people, even if there would be a representation of the population at the time they start the process, the whole idea of deliberation is, of course, to change your opinion. So at the end, the recommendations they would make or the decisions they would take, they would not be representative of the population. And a more practical difficulty, and this is also flagged, for instance, by Francesca Colli in her recent report on participation in the Green New Deal, is that it will be practically very difficult to have a representative sample of the European population in such a forum. And one of the great difficulties is, on the one hand, who decides what are the characteristics that we want representativeness on? Is this just region? Is this occupation? Is this another kind of measurement of precariousness of life. As Albena mentioned, this is particularly also a group that is maybe underrepresented. So how would you decide what the categories are here? So I think that requires a lot of careful thought also about who makes the decision about the relevant categories. And second, it's more a practical problem that we are very often confronted with, even on the local level. How do we get the people that we want to reach, which are the ones that are usually not represented in normal representative politics, into these kind of spaces? So people that don't have the resources to take many weekends off, they are alienated from the process. They don't have this baseline level of trust to even sacrifice their time to enter, or that have other educational barriers that they perceive to be as barriers, because also on the EU level, this means interacting with many other people from different countries and cultures. So I think there are some very practical challenges as well. And the last challenge I would like to raise, and that's interesting because Philip mentioned actually that, that particular article about this problem. So of course, this very general problem is that even if legitimacy perceptions would be improved and strengthened for the people that participate in such a forum, this is a very small group of people. So what we need these processes to do, if they play any role in strengthening the legitimacy, they have to have effects beyond the forum. They have to impact people that just observe the process and just hear about it. And this is also, I think, a particular challenge on the European level, because there's already not as much media coverage as on other governance levels. So I think very careful thought has to be spent on the question, how do we upscale this process and how do we actually make it visible and available and transparent for people that are not personally involved. Thank you. Those were my first comments.
Thank you, Hannah, for managing to condense so many simulating and good points in slightly over 10 minutes. That's great. And since we were so good in staying in time, I think maybe with Philip's okay to quickly go back to Kalypso and then open the floor for the Q&A. I have already Adrienne Héritier signed up in the list of people who wants to contribute. And for the others, please raise your hand and write down your name. So Kalypso, the floor is back to you.
Thank you, both of you, for these brilliant points. I love the guns, they're out. That's what we want for these really important debates. And I mean, I want to just say three things in response. First of all, absolutely, Hannah, my proposal, and to both of you, is not a magic bullet. I mean, Philip gave us a kind order to be very specific. So this is just one proposal. And to Hannah, just to be really, really clear here, this is not what I'm defending today, is not the Citizens' Assembly. I repeat, not. It's upstream. What I call Democratic Panopticon is literally a passive mechanism. It's to put every spending, every project, in which pockets it goes to, who spends how, the money on the web. And that is coordinated by the EU. That's what I described at the beginning. And then it can be appropriated by local social media, local debates, etc. Because usually we're talking about, well, all scales of projects. And this is really important. This is the idea that transparency is a radical democratic idea. That the first affront to democracy is the ways in which the power hides. Power is invisible. And of course, the EU power is invisible to most our citizens. This is, for me, and polls show this, the biggest source of populism and resistance to the EU is the opaqueness. Now, and in addition, I would say, I totally share all of your doubts on whether the involvement of the few, including through Citizens' Assembly at every level, enhances legitimacy and under what condition. I've been very critical of it. Because it's, as Sandel would say in his last book on meritocracy, this is another kind of meritocracy, except you kind of pull it out of a hat through sortition, but then you create a new kind of mini elite for a moment in time. So, and that doesn't mean we should kill assemblies, but they need to be embedded in a bigger, democratic atmospherics. So if we create the Democratic Panopticon on the web, where citizens know how the 750 billion go, it's a way of holding accountable the Citizens Assembly themselves. It's the glue around it. And it's kind of exciting, you know, people. So you both picked up on the fact that citizens, you know, don't have the time. It's Albena's precarity, etc. But the opaqueness doesn't disempower lobbies. It just empowers, you know, big corporate powerful lobbies. Citizens, if they have easy access to what is being done, will be more interested. Maybe they will watch one less season on Netflix and kind of go on that website. I mean, I wouldn't bet my life on it, Albena, but you know, maybe because, you know, how are these few billion, you know, the game, you know, the parlor game, like if you found €1,000 in the street, what would you do with it? 10,000, what would you do with it? 100,000. Have you ever played that in a party after everybody's drunk? You know, people kind of like that. If you had 100 billion, you know, what would you do with it? Okay, so, and that was my second point, is that yes, Albena, black box of democracy, but in a way, how about we think of, you know, inversing the causality? If you create the space, they will come, one way or another, because you break privilege access. But that brings us to the third point. So I hope I've made it clear that this proposal is not on every, you know, mechanism of innovation. And in fact, I would say that it is linked both to representative, to direct, and to deliberative democracy as a resource for all of the above. Now, the final and perhaps most important point for me, just to be very clear, Albena raised it and Hannah, you know, reacted to it also. Yes, you know, ever since I was a wise woman, so-called, no, wise man, in 2008-10, you know, I've been promoting this idea of sustainable integration as a response to Tocqueville. And the point is that to turn the European democratic deficit on its head, to say, hey, EU, you're accused of being undemocratic, and that's kind of right, because we can never, ever throw the rascals out in the EU. They're all around the table, come on the table at different times. We know that. So what you do is say, hey, EU will always be bad at democracy in the short term. I mean, it will manage crisis because it has to, but basically what's its comparative advantage is to be the guardian of the long term and to signal this to citizens. That's what we do, citizens, at the EU level. We can look beyond. We are the response to Tocqueville worry. And indeed, when we talk about the Green Deal, it's all about trade-offs between the short term and the long term. I think that, I mean, I really deeply believe that if we don't create a political dynamic with all the learning, and you said that, Albena, but also in schools, you know, everywhere, learning about distributive impacts of things like, let's just put one on the table, the fact that the Green Deal continues to punish us, to not count us as consumers, but really only focus on producers of carbon emissions. That's one of the greatest inequalities of the regimes that deal with climate change. So consumer, now how do we measure that? How does each project create responsibilities, Albena, to us as consumers? And not just to the producers, and how we do things. There's a huge, big discussions to be had on this. I'm working with the European Parliament on how to democratize scenario planning. So part of that, you know, will go along with the numbers. But the whole point, the whole philosophy is to make visible the trade-offs at stake. And then citizens will be empowered to ask about the end of the month. How do you help us deal with the end of the month if we agree that this, you know, 10 billion should be used for this long-term project? If the conversation is not owned all the way down, we cannot implement this radical change of our societies. So that would be my very quick response.
Okay, thank you, Kalypso, for this initial response. We may maybe get back to some of these points with also the contribution again from the two discussants. For now, I would like to open the floor for Q&A. So maybe we'll start by grouping a couple or three questions. I have two for now. So maybe first Adrienne Héritier and then Miriam Dageford can speak in succession, one after the other. And then we go back to Kalypso. So Adrienne, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. A lot of the points I want to mention were already made, so I'm not going to repeat them, but I would like maybe to hear some more about the question of how exactly kind of reaction of the citizens who are interested and concerned, how exactly institutionally it feeds back into the decisive decision, formal decision-making processes. What is exactly this channel so that indeed it does make an impact? What do you kind of foresee, Kalypso?
Hi, Adrian. Lovely to hear you. Hope to see you soon. And I mean, partly, supply creates demand. So in this case, if you create a dynamic whereby citizens react, say, what? 8 billion on this? What? Who's benefiting? Cui bono? Already that creates the basis for the democratic conversation. But of course, indeed, alongside that pure information about where the money goes and how, that we need to think through democratic pedagogy, Adrian, absolutely, in every place. But my problem with the EU for the last, 30 years, as a pedagogue myself, is I have too often heard we need to inform citizens. It's all about communication and informing. And to this day, if you look at the documents on the Conference on the Future of Europe or the Climate Pact, so often you see communication and information. This idea of the unilateral, top-down, education in that sense. But all of us as pedagogues know that education can only work when it's your students who speak, not you. You add a footnote or two. So let the citizens react, gut reactions. Yeah, some of it may be uncomfortable. Some of it may be so-called populist or whatever. That's kind of the cool thing about democracies. You can't predict what will happen. Democracy is effervescence. It's uncertainty. Sometimes shit hits the fan, but most of the time it brings about, I would argue, better outcomes. But yes, the pedagogy, the information. So the website that the Commission has created, which I've discussed with them in part on the Conference on the Future of Europe, has different bits and pieces on it. You've got information. So here you'd have, where does the money go, how? But then you would have the criteria. Then you would have what such an actor says. Then you'd have blogs by citizens, and they would talk to each other. So you literally have an electronic conversation on the use of fund. And then, of course, you have local debates, you have all sorts of things that accompany it. But the most important thing is upstream, citizens' education in school and in the media, of course.
Thank you, Kalypso. Miriam?
Thanks a lot, Kalypso, for your presentation. And I really like the idea, and I would love to read more about all this. So, and what I found in particular interesting is this upstream moment that you're talking about, and also this radical shift in the thinking about the EU, because I have to say, when I was a student in university, I was reading books and it was always very technical, and there's this institution and this institution, and I wasn't even very interested in studying this because it was so dry. Yeah, and I guess the approach that you're bringing now takes up many of the discussions, but in a more alive way. I feel when you talk, but this is probably also like your personality that comes into it, that the whole idea brings the connection between citizens and the EU more to life, and also is like more up to date than like almost anything that I ever read about it, because it really takes the technological change into account, right? We have something here, and well, Germany is like, I'm German, one of the countries which is like really behind in that, and I feel like you're really up to date with all the stuff that you're doing, and I love it. I have though two acknowledgements, because you're talking about this transnational and this intergenerational stuff. And of course, I love the ideas, and I guess it's really important to acknowledge this. On the other hand, I was thinking, can we really go through this? Because I know the idea that you're having behind, and I completely agree. But if we take, if mainly this is technological change, and we bring all these platforms for citizens into life, to say so. What about a bias that may exist later between the Europeans and the nationalists, right? Are we also making a further divide with this, and how maybe can we overcome this, because that might be quite a critical point. And also talking about intergenerational ideas and transgenerational conversations. I guess the good thing about it is, of course, more younger people will be integrated into this. And I was also following some of the debates from Citizens Are Taking Over Europe. But what about the older, who are not that maybe keen on investing time in technology and debates online and all this stuff, if this is one of the core projects? So these are the 2 points. I guess it brings new spirit into this, but these points are maybe a bit problematic, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Thanks, Miriam. Great to see you. I'm just asking Lorenzo and Philip. Anna and Albena can also jump in, right? And also you, Philip. I mean,
yeah, whenever Anna and Albena want to jump in, maybe they also write their name or raise the hand. For now, we'll have you reply to this, and then maybe we'll group together first Rainer Baubok, and then Philip, and then back to you, or the discussant if they want to jump in.
I just don't want to. I want to hear their great. So I just don't want to monopolize the responses. Not that I have responses, by the way. These are not like responses.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that would kind of be unfaithful to the title of this series, which is Conversation. And, listen to Hannah and her research. And wow, she spends her life thinking about this, and she knows 100 times more than I do. So, these are intuitions, provocation, and blah, blah. Okay. Now, so let me kind of give you some intuitions then. So first of all, what about it creates a new divide? I mean, or not a new divide, but how I actually always push back on Europeanist versus, sovereignist or populist or whatever. And how I call this the tyranny of dichotomies and the tyranny of binaries. And, I hate it when the Macrons of this world frame the European elections as that divide. Come on, guys. How are we going to buy back, maybe not the extreme fringes that want to kill migrants. Yeah, guys, they're like gone for us. But as long as we continue to frame, and I know you don't, Miriam, but, we can't, our political space cannot do that. And part of the whole idea, there's a very big middle in the EU. I've also written separately from this proposal, an article called In Praise of Ambivalence. It's all about Europe and Brexit and all the rest of it. And my assumption there is that most citizens are pretty ambivalent about European integration. They kind of see you have to coordinate and cooperate on, say, vaccines, but on the other hand, they like to be in control because, Bordeaux knows what to do, kind of thing. Okay, so and if that's the case, they're kind of sitting on the fence. So let them see that the EU's created all this helicopter money, which of course they'll have to pay back one day, but that is kind of used in a transparent way. Wow, let them be impressed, even if they're a bit, not completely Euro enthusiasts, right? So part of this idea is to create a space where everybody feels they're on the same plane. They kind of know what's going on. And I think that's one way. It's just one small way. Again, not a magic bullet. A democratic innovation contribution to breaking that divide, which for me is, in the polarization debate, a parallel debate, is we can't just analyze as academics. We need to ask, well, how do you break polarization? Well, that's one way, both by acknowledging our ambivalence and by watching together, panopticoning together, sharing in that space, and then being held to some safeguards by various mechanisms, including education, including each other's gaze. Which brings me then to your second point about old and intergenerational. Now, intergenerational is not just, the oldies like me speaking to my kids. That matters, yes. But it is about the oldies like me, and Philip, I'm not mentioning you and your you know, all your panoplies of children out there and grandchildren. But this is a topic very dear to Philip. Now, of course, it's about imagining the unborn, right? It's a conversation we have about with ourselves about future generations. But to the extent that it is also about that concrete, here and now, intergenerational conversation, you know, if that panopticon can lead the grandkids to come home to their grandparents and say, hey, you want to spend, hey, you know, Oma, Papuli, you know, that's my parents, that's what they're called in Greek and German. Do you want to look at the web together and see what they're doing with the damn money, you know, and like, oh, look, you know, this is how you do it. That's pretty cool, you know. So let's have that conversation, or that technological conversation. Let the grandchildren, and if people don't have grandchildren, you know, it would be kind of cool. Like I remember my kids in their school, you know, they spent half a day per week, every 2 weeks, whatever, in old people's home. And usually they played the piano or something, and it was cool. You know, they sang songs, but what about they have a big screen and they say, hey, let's see how the funds are spent together. And it's well presented. Or let them play with these old, you know, older people in old people's home, like the game, you know, if you had 100,000 euros, what would you do with it? And I tell you, I mean, you know, the firing up, you know, of course, you know, they'll say, well, we want to give that money to you. We don't know what to do with it, except have some good food, you know? So the point is, yeah, money is a great basis for intergenerational conversation. And that will translate at the end of the day in other democratic channels, is my very quick response, but lots more to say, Miriam.
Okay. Thank you, Kalypso. Now I see lots of other guns up and ready to shoot. I have actually 6 people on the list. So what we can do now is maybe start to group questions. So we'll start with Werner, then Philip, and then Anya, all together, one after the other, and then back to you, Kalypso. After that, we have a round of other 3 with Albena, Peter Markovic, and Morgan. So one after the other, Werner, Philip, and Anya.
Hi, Kalypso. Great. So your enthusiasm is really infectious. I was nearly convinced, but then also listening to Hannah, I thought there is something missing, and maybe your proposal is actually too modest. So you put so much emphasis on transparency and the effect it will have on making citizens participate and wanting to know how the money is spent. I think actually the EU is not doing so bad on transparency compared to most other governments. If you want information, you find it somewhere on the internet. The problem is really that you know, people are not motivated only by the availability of information they ought to be interested in. I think what you need is transparency plus. You can't leave it. You can't leave the rest of the process to whatever happens next, deliberative, direct representative democracy, and say this will develop spontaneously. I think you need to say more people will be interested in the information they find in the Panopticon if they know that what happens next will give them some real impact on policy making, on decisions. Leaving that to completely open will mean polarization is reproduced. There will be people who jump at this and then mobilize, and that will happen on social media and in echo rooms that we already know. It will not necessarily bring people together. So probably you need to design, in some ways, citizen assemblies and other mechanisms on top of transparency and say, this is part of the deal. This is part of the package. I don't just leave this completely open, but I want to show how it's possible to feed the information that you will ask the EU to provide into democratic processes that actually result then in policy decisions, and the citizens can understand how this happens.
Yes, should I ask my question? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I have 2 questions. In fact, one is a way of rephrasing Albena's challenge to Kalypso, and the other question is for Hannah. Kalypso, so in a way, your present your Panopticon proposal as a way of moving from representation to participation, but it seems rather to be moving from representation to observation. It's a Panopticon, not a Panpracticon or something like that. So it's emphasizing this aspect, which I also believe is important, of transparency. But of course, transparency is a complex notion. It's not only about visibility, it's about digestibility of the information, it's about intelligibility of that information, it's even more ambitiously accessibility of the information, for example, the impact on climate change and so on. So it's a pretty, when taken seriously, it's a very ambitious notion or ideal, transparency so understood. It's not just a matter of making data available on the web, which, as Werner just said, is something the EU is not that bad at compared to many of our member states. But here comes then so Albena, or reformulation of Albena's challenge in the form of a difficult trade-off, because you could say, well, once you say how demanding it is, of course, many people will be completely excluded from that sort of panopticon, from being able to observe it in the sense that matters, which is also to understand and to be able to assess. And you must make efforts to try to make these people, so to make all this visible, intelligible to more people, to a wider range of people. But at the same time, that's related to the second point, Albena's second point, which is the precarious people are excluded. But the more you try to include them, the more you get Albena's first challenge, because understandably, the people who are in the most precarious situations are the people who care most about the short term, because they may not survive beyond the short term. And so my question to you, in a way also to Albena, is then how do you try to make this trade-off less painful and less cruel? Of course, you could say education, or you could say less capitalism, okay, but at the moment we are still, and for quite a number of centuries, probably stuck with capitalism, and education is a constant challenge, made more difficult even by migration and so on. So are there ways of making this panopticon more accessible for the least well-equipped without making it more oblivious of the long term? And so that's one challenge, not only for the two of you, but for all of us in a way. And my question to Hannah, in a way, it's a bit the converse of Reiner's question, is then, so we saw, Kalypso insisted that her proposal is compatible with citizens' assemblies, but it's distinct from it. But Hannah, do you see something in this idea of the panopticon, or that is in a deeper transparency or wider transparency, as a way of making citizens' assemblies perform better? And that is, whether in terms of the way they function or the way in terms of the impact they may have. And perhaps there was in Reiner's question some suggestion around that. So is there some sort of potentially fruitful complementarity between the two ideas? So greater transparency and then participation by citizens chosen by a lottery. This is my question to you, Juan.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Anya.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kalypso. This was inspiring as ever. I have 3 points, the short points, one on deliberation, one on practice. I'm wondering, in case, I mean, this is not only information, but this will have a deliberative setup around the information about the money that is spent. Then I'm wondering how we can get legitimacy through deliberation on such a scale. I mean, I also think on the ideas of Habermas about deliberative democracy. And I think if we want to have something that can really create open discussions, which can lead to open deliberation and then also to really legitimacy fostering processes, then we probably would need some much more, let's say, organized in a federal way, with little groups of citizens who can talk to each other, and then perhaps on different levels, groups that can then communicate to each other. I think there was in the 1990s an author, I can't remember the name, who had proposed something like this. And then on transparency, my impression from my research is that transparency works very differently in different democracies, and it works differently, for example, in more consonal democracies than it works in more central democracies or Mediterranean democracies, where transparency is much more important, while in consocial democracies, actually, like in Germany, everything takes place behind closed doors, and the transparency comes because the social partners have participated in the negotiation processes. So transparency, I think, is not is something which which is not a remedy to everything, and can even be very very difficult, I think, even for democracy. And then third, I think that the citizenship practice, what we want to get at are the citizens. And then I think that the citizenship practice is so different in different countries. That relates also to your book with Justine Lacroix, that I wonder how we can get to a level playing field where all these people, all these citizens can talk to each other under the same conditions, with the same information, with the same context, because people are expecting their citizenship practice are so many different habitus, if you want, of what democratic participation should be. So yeah, I'm rather opening up a question here, then I don't have a response to this, but I think we really need to think about the scale. On which scale can such a participative process take place, and in which groups?
Okay, thank you, Anya. So now maybe I ask first Kalypso and then also Hannah to reply to the points that were made to them, maybe asking them to be pretty brief and short in their response, because then we also have 3 more people who want to jump: Albena, Peter, and Morgan. So first Kalypso, then Anna. Please be brief. Thank you.
Thanks, Werner, for calling my proposal too modest, because yes, I think that, well, we say ne te fais pas si petit car tu n'es pas si grand in Greece, but so I don't want to claim too much modesty, but indeed, the point is that any proposal in this great, huge realm of democratic thinking, has to be modest, because it's a panoply, it's a mosaic. And indeed, I would say that, I am speaking about radical transparency, and I'm not sure I'm entirely in agreement with you that you can find everything in the EU. You can find, there are web-based, follow-up on laws and regulations, much less on specifically where money goes. And who does it, and I love the way you said, well, if you look hard enough, you'll find it somewhere, which is part of the problem. So it's part of, then we're back to Philip's, intelligibility. And that's the key, Philip. Yes, indeed. I completely agree with what you're saying. That is a panopticon, the guard in Bentham, he thinks a lot about how does he look at the prison, how does he look? How does he see what he sees? So that's part of what, seeing is not just viewing, so we're talking about an active seeing, and that's part of what we need to think about. And there, I really think that we already see controversies in Spain and elsewhere in many EU countries already about how the money is going to be spent. It's going to be huge in Hungary, in Poland, and in countries that have, rule of law problems, because this is the point. It is about demonstrating very visibly where money goes, right? And that's where I bring in Anya's point right now, which is so important. This is such an important point, that transparency is not born equal in every, not just in every national culture, but also social class, etc. I mean, and that's where I think we need to apply what I call in some other work, polycentric subsidiarity, using Ostrom, Elinor Ostrom,'s work, where we, how do you have common basis, a common principle, and indeed, in this case, a common platform that then is decentralized and federalized and applied in different ways. So how that resource is just a resource, nothing more and nothing less, then feeds into different processes. So you could imagine that in Germany, it empowers social partners to do certain things. I'm not sure, Anya, we need to go all the way to level playing field, because there will be different levels. I'm not a football expert, but it will be a bumpy field, but that's okay. Democracy in Europe, democracy is a bumpy field. It looks and feels differently in different countries, but you need to start in the starting blocks, needs to be equalized. And there are indeed countries, maybe not as kosher as Germany, who don't like transparency, or cities, because I think they will be very important to look at the local level. And yes, to Werner, that the impact then of something like this is to think about how it is channeled, and in other mechanisms. Yes, indeed, assemblies, but then these assemblies are listened to and acknowledged and part of a global, a democratic debate differently if they have that kind of backup. But same for traditional elections. Think of how different they would be if candidates have to make statements about how people, what are they seeing with their panopticon. Or my favorite unapplied democratic innovation, preferenda rather than referenda, where citizens, speak of in something we explored in 2005 with the Dutch government after the no. And so that's my quick response to Werner and Anja. And finally, Philip, I did agree totally with you on intelligibility. And finally, on inclusion, I think we need to put all our heads together on this the hardest question of it all. How do you make capitalism less cruel, the trade-off less cruel, as you said, Philip? In part, it's by acknowledging these trade-offs and saying, if it is the poorest who obviously tend to bear the cost, and if now they see it and it's more explicit and is becoming more and more explicit through all sorts of mechanisms, then our polities need to think about how to compensate the losers much more explicitly and democratically. It's what democracy is supposed to be about, at least in the globalization context. But, how do we make that happen better? Democratizing global capitalism, not only less of it, is the name of the game, because there will be still always, sorry, Albena, but some capitalism left, however less we have it.
Okay, thank you, Kalypso. Now, Hannah, and really, please, if you can stay around 1 to 2 minutes, then we can have the final round.
I'll try my best. Thank you very much, Philip, for the question about whether coupling a transparency mechanism like the Panopticon that Kalypso describes with citizens' assemblies, whether that would be beneficial for this legitimacy strengthening potential. And I see like 3 ways in which that would be indeed very beneficial. And I think they were already touched upon a bit by Kalypso, or actually extensively. So I think one thing is it would really increase attention for how the decision is made. And if that would be through a citizens' assembly afterwards or another kind of decision making, it could also be purely representative. There would be indeed this increased attention. That would mean for a citizens' assembly, it would actually address this problem of having only a handful of citizens involved, but it actually impacts the wider society. So I think that's one big advantage. Another one is that we could use this stage to set the agenda. And I think that's also very much what Kalypso is saying, that what we need is a bottom-up instrument where people can also decide where the conversation goes. And that is also, of course, often used in how citizens' assemblies are set up, that you first have one assembly that sets an agenda through citizens' input, and then actually have the process on that topic. And then last, to indeed have the decision-making process, whatever it may be, to hold it accountable and check back whether the concerns that were voiced were indeed taken up. I also see a difficulty or a challenge And I think that just comes naturally from the trade-off between should we have processes for participation that are entirely bottom-up, or should they be top-down organized? And of course, Kalypso's proposal would be to have it bottom-up so that indeed the citizens are in control of what's happening. And on the other hand, of course, what we do see is that that would require people to have the resources to actually do that. And really often, if you have these very open processes, it's a very particular group of citizens that have the resources that can process the information. This is intelligibility point to play a part. So then if this group of citizens that was really very much self-selected decides what the agenda is, the question is this a legitimate way of deciding what the next steps are in the process? So I think there's just an inherent trade-off. And if we think of participatory process that managed well at including vulnerable or underrepresented voices, they were actually very, very, very much top-down designed. So participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, for instance, they had very clear guidelines of what kind of people do we need to get in here and how do we recruit these people. And a lot of efforts were invested because citizens themselves, they don't have the resource to self-recruit them into these processes. And I think that's an important point as well.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, again, for squeezing so much content in such a little amount of time. Now really 1 minute each, and we apologize for this. Maybe this conversation should last at least a couple of hours and not 1.5. And it's always a good thing when we have so many good contributions and so many people wanting to contribute to the discussion. So Albena, then Petar, then Morgana.
Okay, thank you. Shortly on capitalism, we can have a market economy in which policy is not driven by the profit motive. It's not very difficult actually to do. But more importantly, we keep invoking the infamous deficit of democracy. But I think we have in fact misdiagnosed, mislabeled the problem. The problem is with the deficit of accountability, not of democracy. And this is why I like actually Kalypso's proposal so much, because what she says, it is not about citizens' assembly, it is not about citizens' input into the decision making, it's about radical transparency. So what indeed we need to be thinking about are what are the spectrum of possibilities to enhance accountability beyond, you know, what we have losing elections, on the one hand, which is very weak, it's proven very weak. On the other extreme, we have the criminalization of political responsibility. Of course, this is too strong, but there is a spectrum of options there that need to be explored. So this transparency that Kalypso advocates, isn't that already done by the mass media? Shouldn't we then simply enhance independence of the media, strengthen investigative journalism? Isn't already the fourth power doing this job of transparency? So I would just appeal that we label correctly, we diagnose correctly the problem, and we call it for what it is. It's a deficit of accountability.
Thank you very much, Albena. Petar.
Hi, everyone. I love the proposal, and it's impossible to put it in 1 minute, but I will try. I have 2 invitations for further discussion, and the first one has to do with legitimacy. Quickly, I think we've already lost the battle with throughput legitimacy, because the country quotas for the recovery budget, etc., are being negotiated behind closed doors. But we can work a lot with Kalypso's proposal on enhancing output and input legitimacy. On output legitimacy, I think that the radical transparency of how the money is spent can indeed create a positive dynamic in spite of the objections raised. The example I will give you is from the ICAS publication published earlier this year called Next Level Participation, which looked at non-institutional citizen-led e-participation tools, of which one was a Romanian best practice called Harta Banilor Publici, which is basically 10 years of public procurement data transfigured so that they're super obvious infographics for citizens. So publicly available data made easy to use for citizens. And then we cannot even imagine the ways in which this enhanced accountability, investigative journalism, citizens themselves becoming, scrutinizing the data, etc. Next level, okay, so I covered that. How this will interact with input legitimacy, which was Professor Bobak's concern. I think that if we cannot preset citizen assemblies and mechanisms completely, because we see with the Conference on the Future of Europe that this becomes a stumbling block. We need to have more faith in the spontaneity and creativity of citizens. Second point, how do we assure a level playing field in a situation of enormous differences in political culture and socioeconomic conditions? I feel that, and I invite you all to register for the ICAS conference on the 20th of April, which will look at the brand new proposal to have a European agency on citizenship education, which is one of the ways of or the infrastructure building for creating this level playing field. And just on the point of deficits, I feel, at least in my research, that we are now moving from the discourse on democratic deficit to the discourse of democratic empowerment, and the subversion of the panopticon into a democratic tool against arbitrary politics that Kalypso proposed is a perfect roadmap towards that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Morgan?
Yes, thank you. I apologize because my camera isn't working. I'm really sorry about that. I have more of a theoretical question for you, Kalypso, regarding what such a common European fund would allow for, more precisely. I wonder, for instance, how would the spending priorities be determined, and at which level? If there are some EU guidelines, for instance, regarding how the money should be spent for green transition, for instance, then how democratic, how plainly democratic is the fund? What I have in mind is that if some localities wanted to spend this fund in a basic income sort of way, would that be possible in your proposal? But if it is possible to spend the money in any possible way, I mean, if there are no guideline priorities decided by the EU, then it leaves room for an individual basic income, for instance, but then we would absolutely lose track of what the money is spent for. We would lose track of how the money is spent, and we would lose this sort of panopticon contribution, right? So if the fund would merely become a European basic income, I'm not saying this is not an interesting move, I think it's a very interesting move, but if it would become a European basic income, for instance, would that be compatible with your proposal? That is my question, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. Maybe since one of the questions was really directed at Kalypso's proposal, maybe Kalypso, just for you, one final remark in a couple of sound bits.
It's not a be-all and end-all, but it raises many questions, and Morgan's question would be asked, and that's actually the beauty of the fact that right now we do know that the EU has set priorities, and then governments, the state, translates these priorities. And this proposal is not as radical as Castoriadis' l'auto-institution de la société. This is about the state and citizens working, together. Their authority is dispersed, but it's not simply dissolved in our story. So it's a co-constitution of priorities. So I would not be the one to answer, but to the extent that X, whether it's a basic income or whatever, serves the Green Deal, to the extent that it's a way of reconciling the long term and the short term, the losers and the winners of various, then maybe that's part of the conversation. But let's not forget the panopticon is a condition, a background condition of radical transparency. And I just want to end, Lorenzo, by saying that, hearing all of the commentaries from, Philip, Albena, and Hannah, and all the questions, reminds me, and after I asked for guns, it does remind me of how the Chinese, when they discovered powder, they made fireworks with it rather than guns. And that's what you've done for me. So thanks for these fireworks. Loved it.
Okay, thank you, Kalypso. We are well over 2 p.m. so we can wrap things up towards the end of this very engaging and stimulating discussion. If we stay again on the analogy of the guns, it was really a shootout, and we'd have kept shooting until 3 p.m. maybe, and which is really the idea behind this conversation, not to have the general seminar where just a couple of questions, but really a lively stimulating and even heated discussion at some point. I would like to thank again the panelists and all the participants. For the normal EGPP seminar series, we reconvene next week with a book presentation titled European Ambition, the Group of the European People's Party and European Integration, with Luciano Bardi and Jacopo Cellini from the Alcide De Gasperi Center as speaker. And now, before closing, I leave again the floor to Philip, if he wants to say a couple of concluding remarks, and giving us also a preview of the next conversation for the future of Europe, which will take place on May 5th. So thank you again to all, and Philip, the final floor is yours.
Yes, given that we are over time, I'll be extremely brief, just to say that the next conversation for the future of Europe will be in May. We'll then have 3 such conversations successively in 3 successive weeks. And the next one will be by Ulrike Gero, will be introduced by Ulrike Gero. As most of you know, she's the fiercest European Republican around, and she'll be talking about how the ambition of a post-national conception of citizenship can and must inspire the conference on the future of the European Union. Thank you very much to our 3 speakers, in particular, also to Sarah and the staff, other members of the staff at the UI for making this possible. I think really the spirit of the conversations was beautifully illustrated by the way in which you fed our conversation. So thank you very much, and see you at the latest at the beginning of May. Bye-bye.